and thank you all for having taken time out of your busy schedules and amid this heat to come here today. It has always been a great honor to be an Ushioda Fellow at Tokyo College, and it's a great pleasure now to be able to be here to deliver my third public lecture in that role. As Mita-sama said, my first public lecture in May 2019 was about gender equality, Japan's far more female future, the likely impact on this country of the increased access of women to full four-year university courses starting in the 1990s. And my second lecture was in May 2022, after the gap imposed by the COVID pandemic, was about, as Mita-sama said, the presence in our world of radical uncertainty, symbolized both by the COVID pandemic and by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which had just happened at that time, and how we can understand and react to this. What I argued at the time was that we think we can predict many things in the world, but actually these kinds of events have shown that all we can really do is to prepare and to try to remain as adaptable as possible so as to react and adjust as quickly as we can when shocks occur. And so now, here in 2023, for my third lecture, I am switching to the issue of defense and security in the Indo-Pacific. For the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, a think tank whose board I have the honor of chairing, I am researching and writing a book on this topic, which I hope will be published next year in 2024. This issue might sound technical and even specialist, but let us be clear. Essentially, the topic of my lecture, and hence the eventual book, is whether and how we can prevent World War III breaking out in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years over Taiwan, North Korea, or some other flashpoint. There could be no more important issue than this. On this question depends the fate of the world in every sense in this 21st century. In the terms of my lecture on radical uncertainty last year, this would be the biggest sort of shock of all. Like a pandemic, this is a shock that can be readily predicted as a possibility, but it cannot actually be forecast in any real sense. What we can do is to try to work to make this shock less likely to occur, and that effort is the real purpose of this lecture. As I say, this is no technical issue, and unfortunately, it is far from a theoretical issue either. If conflict were ever to break out between the United States and China, it would be truly devastating in every sense. The past few years have seen the publication of many earnest, serious studies trying to calculate what might be the economic cost to the world of a war over Taiwan in particular. Personally, I think these economic studies are well-intentioned efforts to measure the unmeasurable. And in any case, they miss the real point. If war were really to break out, economics would be the least important thing to worry about. For this would be a war that we should expect to be not just tragic and local, like the one going on now in Ukraine, but global and potentially unlimited. This means that the consequences, economic, environmental, social, political, would also be potentially unlimited. And if such a terrible war, a true World War III, were to happen, economic calculations would play little or no part in it. The cause would be political. The calculations made on either side about whether to fight or whether to take the risk of a fight breaking out would be political calculations, not, I think, commercial or economic ones. Now, it is naturally always important to prevent any devastating conflict. But why should this be an issue of particular importance, relevance, and therefore interest now in 2023? The University of Tokyo's Excellent Security Studies Unit has, like others, told us for decades that East Asia is full of flashpoints, all representing unfinished business from the Pacific War, from the Cold War, or from wars further back in history, in the Korean Peninsula, in Taiwan, in the many unresolved territorial disputes throughout the region. This has been true throughout what can be described as East Asia's long peace, the period since 1979 when the last interstate conflict took place in the region, which was the invasion of Vietnam by China. There have, of course, been interstate conflicts in South Asia between India and Pakistan, or in West Asia, such as the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. But East and Southeast Asia have benefited hugely from 4 decades of peace. Internal conflicts have also occurred, such as those in Indonesia or now in Myanmar, but not conflicts between nations, the sort of conflicts which are also likely to draw in other countries and affect a whole region or even the whole world. Without that long peace, the countries of East and Southeast Asia would not have been able to enjoy their historic rise to prosperity and their historic reductions in poverty. The durability of that long peace has always been questioned at every stage. When I took on the job of editor-in-chief of The Economist 30 years ago this year, the first cover story of my very first issue as editor in April 1993 expressed a worry about a likely future arms race in Asia as nations competed with one another to build up their military forces. Our diplomatic editor at that time proposed the cover to me, knowing, of course, of my interest in Japan and in Asia. But also, she was genuinely concerned. The background to that concern was the rise of China in economic, geopolitical, and military terms, which was likely, she thought, to disrupt existing power balances and relationships and cause new fears among many countries. China was therefore likely to build up its military forces, and so would other countries do so in response. That concern remains a fundamental one today, one we can see written clearly into Japan's new national security strategy that was published last December. But as that memory from 1993 indicates, this is far from new. We have all been talking and thinking about this for decades. Japan's stance towards this threat has finally changed, but the issue has not. So we must keep on asking ourselves, why should all these flashpoints and this general issue of the rise of China cause us to worry now about not just conflict, but the worst sort of conflict of all, namely a world-scale war between 2 nuclear-armed superpowers? In one sense, the answer stands right in front of us, given the war that is already taking place in the heart of Europe. Prime Minister Kishida framed the question very well in his keynote speech in 2022 to the International Institute for Strategic Studies' big annual conference in Singapore, the Shangri-La Dialogue, when he said, and I quote, "What happens today in Ukraine could happen tomorrow in East Asia. What has happened in Europe is that a nuclear-armed superpower, Russia, has invaded its neighbor, Ukraine, a country which had been an independent sovereign nation since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Russia is thereby trying to recreate the control over the territory surrounding its borders that it had when it was the Russian Empire in the 19th century or the Soviet Union in the 20th. As a result, the idea that was entrenched in the founding charter of the United Nations in 1945, that national borders should not again be changed by military force, is being challenged in a brutal, destructive, and tragic way. And the country that has challenged or disregarded this principle, Russia, was itself a founding signatory to the UN Charter and is one of the world's 2 leading nuclear powers. In making its invasion, moreover, Russia has threatened to use nuclear weapons, first so as to deter outside powers from intervening in support of Ukraine, and later even as threats against Ukraine itself. We can debate endlessly about whether or not this threat was or still is credible. And once the Ukraine war is over, we will have a better idea of whether the threat did or did not succeed in its aim of deterrence. But what this appalling episode has already made clear is that when a nuclear-armed superpower chooses to use military force to achieve an international objective, one tool at its disposal to seek to deter others from intervening, or potentially a tool to force its target into submission, is and always will be the threat of using a nuclear weapon. The Cold War principle of mutual deterrence by virtue of the expectation of mutually assured destruction, should one side dare to use nuclear missiles, simply does not provide the same degree of protection in the case of an invasion of a non-nuclear country by a nuclear one. As Prime Minister Kishida said, there must be a real danger of this example being followed in East Asia in any or all of its characteristics. This is especially so because Russia's full invasion of Ukraine on February the 22nd last year was preceded just 18 days earlier by a joint statement by the governments of Russia and China, released during a meeting in Beijing between President Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping, which called for a change in the way in which the world is governed. The two presidents stated that the strategic partnerships between Russia and China, quotes, knows no limits. And although the joint statement claimed that the two countries were in full support of global governance through multilateral institutions in accordance with agreed rules, as long as those rules were not manipulated by the West, the statement and Russia's subsequent invasion showed that what Russia and China actually believe is that rules and multilateral institutions should exist to govern the behavior of smaller countries, but not the behavior of civilizational superpowers, which is what Russia and China claim to be. In a sense, what they say they want is an equal right both to manipulate the rules and to be considered an exception to them. In Russia's case, this is a claim made by a superpower whose economy is small, whose population is declining, and whose export income depends heavily on the fossil fuels of oil and gas, whose era is passing. Russia's sole real claim to being a superpower is its nuclear arsenal. But China's case is very different. Its economy is the second largest in the world. It is increasingly strong in new technologies. And although its population too has begun to decline, it is doing so because of a low birth rate, not because of falling life expectancy, as in Russia. China really is a superpower, and what the joint statement with Russia made clear is that it expects to be treated in all aspects of world affairs as being an equal to the United States, which also means, as I mentioned just before, that just as America often sees itself as being exceptional and therefore not subject to all international rules and laws, so China believes that it too should have the right to be considered exceptional. This is not unreasonable. One might even call it realistic. A very reasonable fear for the past decade, in fact, has been a fear that the world that was emerging might be one in which everything that really matters in global affairs might be determined by agreement between these two exceptional superpowers, leaving the rest of us to have to fall into line. On this view, it would be the so-called G2 of China and the United States that would govern the world, not the Western G7 or the much wider G20. As a European, albeit from a country that has long been an ally of the United States, I would not relish the emergence of a G2 world. I would prefer a world in which power is more dispersed among a wider range of countries, forcing a wider set of consultations and processes. In fact, as I will argue, I believe that such a world is likelier to emerge than a G2 one. Nonetheless, a G2 world would still be better than one in which the two superpowers actually fight. The tensions between the United States and China that have grown over the past 5 years to such an extent that communication between the two countries' leaders has diminished considerably, tells us that the prospect of a G2 world is disappearing over the horizon. That said, I am not one of those who think that the opposite outcome, conflict, is inevitable. I do not believe that the mere rise of a new superpower, China, makes war with the previous dominant power inevitable. Such a prediction really should not be true in the modern world, a world of widespread knowledge and interconnections, and especially a modern world in which the concept of mutually assured destruction should continue to apply to nuclear-armed superpowers. China's economy is indeed now roughly equal in size to that of the United States. As with Japan in the 1980s, relations between the world's two biggest economies features a great deal of trade friction. The Trump administration's imposition of high tariffs on Chinese imports in 2018 was an example of this, which the Biden administration has maintained. There is also technological friction, which the Biden administration has intensified through export controls on advanced semiconductor technology, which have been coordinated with allies, notably Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands. This technological friction contains elements of economic rivalry and of military rivalry, which it is hard, perhaps impossible, to unravel from one another. Nonetheless, actually, the economic competition between the two superpowers might well be peaking or even passing its peak, with China's population aging rapidly and starting to fall, just as Japan's population did beginning in the 1990s, and with an increasingly rigid, state-controlled economy finding it harder to generate growth. The likeliest prospect now is for China's overall economic size and power to remain roughly equivalent to that of the United States, but not to surpass it in any significant way. In this regard, China's economy emulated Japan during its high-growth years, and now looks set to emulate Japan during its slow-growth years too. This may offer some reassurance about US-China rivalry in the longer term, at least in economic terms. But it is not enough to reassure security scholars and political scientists, and rightly so. In recent years, much learned American discourse has focused on whether the analysis made by the classical Greek historian Thucydides more than 2 millennia ago will apply to China and the United States in this 21st century. The so-called Thucydides trap occurs when the rise of a new power causes mutual fears between the rising and the incumbent power that provide a motivation or incentive for conflict. Conflict to preempt the rising power, or conflict initiated by the rising power to prevent its own rise from being blocked. Graham Allison, the veteran political scientist at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, has written compellingly about this Thucydides trap. His analysis of past eras when a new power rivaled incumbent ones led him to the view that the danger of war between China and the United States is high in statistical terms, though he does not argue that this makes it unavoidable. Indeed, the whole point of talking about the Thucydides trap is to try to make the avoidance of war a higher priority. China's trajectory is plainly towards equality, as I said earlier. Much attention is paid to the expansion of its military forces towards that same sort of equality, which has indeed been eye-catching. China's military budget has risen by double-digit amounts annually in many recent years. Nonetheless, this is actually not either surprising or necessarily menacing. The Chinese military budget has been able to rise rapidly because China's economic growth, and hence its public resources, has also been rapid. Measured in proportion to China's GDP, the country's military spending has actually been fairly stable at more or less 2%. This is equivalent to British military spending and is lower than American military spending of a little more than 3% of GDP. But attention is also now being paid to Chinese plans to expand its nuclear arsenal. Although China formally became a nuclear weapons state in 1964, since then it has maintained a nuclear strategy known as minimum deterrence. Its nuclear stockpile of just over 400 warheads is far smaller than those of either the United States or Russia. The United States has over 5,000 nukes, of which roughly 1/3 are defined as deployed, which means they are ready to be delivered in principle. Recently, the US Department of Defense has reported evidence it has uncovered of Chinese plans to expand its nuclear stockpile to 1,500 weapons by the early 2030s. Yet that would still leave China's nuclear arsenal considerably smaller than that of the United States. There is, of course, plenty of reason to be concerned about any country that seems set on expanding its arsenal of the most destructive and terrible weapons of all. But on the face of it, a move to narrow the gap with the United States and its allies is not in itself surprising and concerning. For specialists, the main concern is that unlike with the Soviet Union and now Russia, there is no formal process of arms control talks, let alone treaties, between China and the United States to make these arsenals more transparent. But again, it would not be surprising if China were to believe that the right time for an arms control negotiation with the United States to begin would be when a greater equality has been achieved between the two superpowers, not beforehand. In my view, the real worry is not the Thucydides trap in its traditional form. The real reason to worry could be exactly the fact that rather than being an ever-rising power, China's rise is in fact slowing or plateauing. Its emulation of Japan in economic and social terms has the potential to produce a real military danger. That danger would be the danger of a view taking hold in China, or in the Chinese political leadership, that this economic plateauing means that the country has a limited opportunity to secure a big political and strategic opportunity, namely Taiwan. China likes to argue that Taiwan is a different category of issue from that of Ukraine, that it is, quotes, an internal matter for China, that Taiwan's separation from the motherland since 1895 represents both a historical wrong and a major piece of unfinished business for the Communist Party that restored stability to China in 1949 after a long civil war and an even longer conflict with Japan. Yet in truth, Taiwan's relationship to China is unfortunately not very different to Ukraine's relationship to Russia in many respects. In history, like Ukraine, Taiwan has sometimes been controlled by China and sometimes by other countries, Portugal, Spain, and Japan, notably. It has not had the sort of tight historical relationship to the mainland that Chinese propagandists like to claim. Moreover, since 1949, it has existed as a de facto independent entity, which is longer than Ukraine has. In a major essay in 2021, President Vladimir Putin presented a detailed argument concerning what he called, quotes, the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. He claimed that Russians and Ukrainians were really one people with a joint historical and cultural origin. He said that Vladimir Lenin's decision to define Ukraine as a separate unit within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922 was a historic mistake, as was Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin's decision to agree to Ukraine's independence in 1991. Thus, the first lesson from the Ukraine war is this, that when autocratic dictators write in public essays or speeches what their beliefs and intentions are, we should take them very seriously. Putin told us what he believed and what he wanted to do, and then he did it. Like Putin, President Xi Jinping has used many speeches to underline what he sees as the historical unity of the Chinese and Taiwanese, and to state clearly his intention of achieving what he sees as reunification of Taiwan with China. This needs to be taken very seriously. So too does the fact that the extremely powerful President Xi has given an increased emphasis to this issue in recent years. Moreover, the second lesson from Ukraine may be that it may precisely be an actual or perceived decline in a superpower's strength and capacity that brings dangers, rather than a rise in that strength. Many of us have puzzled over why Putin decided last year to attempt a full-scale conquest of Ukraine. His tactics in 2014 of using covert pressure and limited military intervention to achieve the annexation of the Ukrainian province of Crimea, an area the size of the country of Belgium, and to dominate the eastern part of Ukraine, ought to have suggested that further gradual pressure tactics would have served him best. Security analysts have termed such tactics as salami slicing. So why did Putin decide to try for eating the whole meal rather than taking it piece by piece? Such salami tactics would have been far less likely to cause the US and the rest of the West to provide military support to Ukraine. The answer may well lie in Putin's worry about Russia's weakness, not its strength. Time was not on his side, he may have concluded. And in a state of weakness, a grab for territory, holding what he saw as great strategic value, held the potential of compensating for that weakness. It might have held out economic benefit too. How about Taiwan? Is it of similar strategic importance? One temptation is to accept China's view of Taiwan as a purely internal issue. The information war that has long been underway is a battle to define Taiwan precisely in that way and to play down the strategic issue. Outsiders would certainly not wish this issue to be resolved by violence. In the event of violence, Taiwan's 23 million population and its thriving democracy would certainly receive a great deal of sympathy. But sympathy is not the same as actual military support, especially if a conflict is seen as an internal issue. Just as most countries shrug their shoulders at the fact that Hong Kong has become completely controlled by China and has lost all its traditional freedoms, in violation of China's commitment to allow, quotes, one country, two systems, to persist for 50 years following Hong Kong's return in 1997 from British colonial rule, many people might also shrug their shoulders if Taiwan were to lose its freedoms and its democracy. This would especially be so if China chose to follow Putin's earlier style of salami slicing rather than an outright invasion. In Taiwan's case, this would likely consist of what the US military terms a soft blockade, a Chinese imposition of naval and air control over Taiwanese seas and skies that gave it the ability to control the access of goods and people to the island. Such a soft blockade would transfer what security analysts call escalation risk over to the US and other potential opponents. It would dare the United States to challenge this imposition of control. This does look the likeliest scenario for a Chinese attempt at coerced unification of Taiwan. It would also be the most challenging for the US, Japan, or anyone else to respond to. Yet, let's be realistic, it also might not succeed. In such a scenario, Taiwan might be able simply to tough it out. The political and social pressure might be intense, but as we have seen in Ukraine, such pressure might reinforce the Taiwanese people's sense of identity and resistance rather than challenging it. Hence the real fear, the fear that Xi Jinping might decide that neither he nor China has time to wait for a soft blockade to work, that instead a full military blockade or even an attempted invasion might be better options. Or the fear that the United States would decide that its best response would be to try to transfer the escalation risk onto China by seeking to force it to harden up the blockade or to attempt a full-scale invasion. Here, we need to interject another big question. Why would it be worth it for China or Xi Jinping to take these risks, whether of the salami slicing type or especially the risk and cost of a real invasion? And why would it be worth it for America to take huge military risks, the risk of World War III, to challenge it? The answer, in fact, is that Taiwan does hold an actual or perceived importance both to China and to others, not just for historical reasons or for reasons of democratic values and the rule of law. Like Ukraine, the island of Taiwan holds strategic importance given its position just off the Chinese coast and in the South China Sea, which is exactly why outside powers like Portugal and Japan cared about it in centuries past, and why China did too eventually. In essence, whoever controls Taiwan has the chance to control the whole of that region. In times of peace, especially long peaces such as that enjoyed by East Asia during this also long period of globalization, such issues of strategic importance or control can seem rather outdated. Ships navigate freely through the South China Sea and through narrow bodies of water such as the Taiwan and Malacca Straits. Trade flows and people move about. Nonetheless, last year when I came to Tokyo and gave my second public lecture at Tokyo College, in other meetings, I was very struck by comments made to me by many Japanese diplomats and public intellectuals. Those diplomats and intellectuals were, of course, shocked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the striking point to me was not that one. It was that many raised a special concern about the response to Russia's invasion by the United States. President Joe Biden had explicitly ruled out direct involvement in the Ukraine conflict by saying that he did not want to risk starting World War III. My Japanese diplomatic friends drew an immediate negative implication from this comment, that his remarks risked telling China and Xi Jinping that America would also not want to risk starting World War III in Asia by intervening in the case of Chinese coercion or invasion of Taiwan. That implication, and I imagine fierce private criticism or pressure from America's allies in Japan and elsewhere in the region, explains, I think, why President Biden has now stated 4 times in public that under his leadership, America would indeed intervene militarily in the event of what is known somewhat euphemistically as a Taiwan contingency. Each time, White House officials painstakingly explained to the media and therefore to Chinese officials that this did not mean that America's stance on Taiwan had changed. The US is still committed, they said, to the, quotes, one China policy, the somewhat strange but still enormously significant position that there is only one China and that the governments in Beijing and Taipei are simply rivals to govern that one China as they have been since 1949. The important point is that President Biden had felt obliged to state publicly that the US would intervene directly to protect Taiwan. And the related important point is that Japanese diplomats and some intellectuals had taken the view that if the US's decision not to join the war in Ukraine meant that the US would not intervene to protect Taiwan, then this could imply that America's whole strategic position in Asia was under threat. And just as important, this would imply a rising risk to Japan itself, to its southwestern islands that are the closest non-Chinese territories to Taiwan, and then to the whole Ryukyu island chain, including, of course, the Senkakus, but also, ultimately, Okinawa. News recently that some Chinese scholars have begun to claim that Okinawa and the Ryukyus have close historical ties to China must inevitably add to that concern. I remember a Japanese diplomat saying to me about 15 years ago that China, in his view, would ultimately have ambitions to take Okinawa. It did not feel very credible at the time, nor really does it do so now. But the fact that the Chinese political leadership allowed this claim to be publicized, not caring about any hostile international reaction, suggests that the claim is not at all fanciful. In fact, in fairness, we ought also to note some of the views coming from scholars and lobbyists in the United States too, albeit from a much freer and therefore diverse intellectual and strategic community. The views I mention and I feel what we need to note are that strategists close to some parts of the Republican Party have begun to argue for a big US military buildup to counter China, and at the same time to argue that American support for Ukraine is a wasteful distraction from its real threat, namely China. Associated with, but not directly connected to this sort of argument is an idea of preemption, that it may be to America's advantage to preempt a Chinese action over Taiwan by declaring it independent, rather as President Donald Trump chose defiantly to move America's embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in order to make a bold political point. This call for recognition of Taiwan's independence is not anything even close to a mainstream view, but it was made last year by Donald Trump's former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, so we have to take it seriously. Moreover, at the same time as we all know and are somewhat concerned about America's presidential elections coming up in November 2024, attention is beginning to be paid to the fact that Taiwan, too, is holding a presidential election in January next year. There are three main candidates. We are still a long way ahead of the election, so predictions are fruitless. However, we should note that in the past few days, the current frontrunner, William Lai Ching-te of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, caused controversy by stating that, quotes, "When Taiwan's president can enter the White House, the political goal we have been pursuing will have been achieved." The significance of this is that the agreements that have governed America's relationship with both China and Taiwan since 1979, when diplomatic relations were re-established between the US and China, dictate that Taiwanese officials should not be treated by Washington as if they are representatives of a recognized sovereign country. So an aspiration to, quote, "enter the White House" sounds also like an aspiration for a declaration of independence or for recognition of de facto independence. Even a move towards such a declaration or recognition has been defined by China as not merely unacceptable, but as a potential casus belli, a cause for war. So where are we now in 2023? We are, I think, in a situation in which the crucial goal for all countries, both inside the Indo-Pacific and around the world, must be to deter conflict. For if a conflict were to take place between these two nuclear-armed superpowers, the stakes would be so high as to make a true potential World War III. During the long Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, we learned to define deterrence as primarily nuclear deterrence, hence the importance of mutually assured destruction, of doctrines about nuclear use, and ultimately of arms control agreements that provided transparency and improved trust. However, the deterrence task in the Indo-Pacific is far more complex. It is complex because in military terms, it is primarily a deterrence against the use of conventional military forces in an invasion or blockade of Taiwan, but with nuclear deterrence standing behind the conventional sort, and, as in Ukraine, nuclear deterrence potentially having a use as a way to make a conventional military operation easier. Such conventional deterrence is difficult, as Putin's invasion of Ukraine showed. An invasion of Taiwan would also be hugely difficult. But to deter such an invasion would also require deterrent forces to be capable of arriving quickly into the theater of conflict, which is also difficult even if good intelligence provides plenty of warning. Nonetheless, this task of deterrence is also complex because in political or strategic terms, it is in fact now three-way deterrence. Deterrence, as I said, of a Chinese invasion or blockade by raising the perceived military costs and risks of such actions, and by increasing the credibility of a military response should such actions be contemplated. But also deterrence of any move towards independence by Taiwan. And thirdly, deterrence of any move in American politics of moving preemptively on Taiwan or using the threat of such preemption as a weapon against China. The military part of this is the simplest to analyze, although the prime effect of deterrence has to be psychological through the raising of greater and greater doubts in the mind of your adversary. America's strategy here, for the time being, is clear: to deal with a broad deterioration in the military balance with China in the South China Sea by changing its force posture and the posture of a coalition of allies so as to convince China that it would face a costly military response in case of war. Japan's defense buildup and deployment of forces and logistics to bases closer to Taiwan forms a key part of this. So does America's recent agreement with the Philippines to provide new logistical facilities for American forces in the Philippines archipelago. In the longer term, the AUKUS agreement providing nuclear-propelled submarines to Australia, along with a lot of other technological cooperation, will also play a key part. And US forces themselves are attempting to move around more in the region, showing that while America's fixed bases in Japan, Korea, and Guam might be a target for Chinese missiles, nimble US forces will actually be all present in the region in different places. Yet the politics of it all, compared with this military issue, are even harder to think about and impossible to predict. The politics of Taiwan, the politics of the United States as it moves between electoral cycles, and the politics of China, especially if I'm right that China's economic course may in future be difficult. So ultimately, the conclusion must mix a sense of pessimistic realism with some longer-term optimism. The pessimistic realism is that, as with Ukraine, the danger of conflict is real, and the practical danger is of any one of the three political entities, China, Taiwan, and the United States, either seizing or creating an opportunity, which could then bring about the devastation we fear. The longer-term optimism is that the increased involvement in regional security and all the diplomacy associated with it by Japan in a big way and other countries in a smaller way could increase the amount of influence that you and other partners have on the three countries that pose this big danger. And alongside that trend is the also long-term optimistic view that China is destined to become less exceptional in world affairs as other countries, especially India and Indonesia, themselves rise to become economic, political, and even eventually military powers. Such a world of more dispersed power could be a more stable one and could lower the strategic stakes in a US-China conflict. But we are not there. We are in a difficult, dangerous period of transition in historical terms, if this longer-term vision is anything like correct. Our task, therefore, is to keep the peace during that transition, and it is a vital task. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward very much to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for excellent lecture, Mr. EMMOTT. It is my great pleasure to speak in front of you as a commentator to this excellent discussion, excellent lecture. And thank you for organizer giving me, I think, 15 to 20 minutes. I don't know. I really don't think I need that long time, but let me start. First, I want to start to highlight 2 points from the lecture, which particularly impressed me. First, quote, "We are in a difficult, dangerous period of transition." End of quote. Yes, we have to aware we are in a very, very difficult period of transition, and this is extremely dangerous. Quote, "Our world of radical uncertainty," end of quote. Yes, he presents his idea with difficult question, how to deal with this acute uncertainty. Russia's invasion of Ukraine also coincided with a possible challenge to the status quo by a nuclear power. And he emphasized slowing economic growth in China makes Xi Jinping believe the window of opportunity is closing, and he is likely to take action if he believes the further partial action has a good chance of success. Yes, everything is very uncertain, and could start very rapidly. You know, this is we have to face at this moment. And for Xi Jinping, the reputational and economic cost from Taiwan contingency might not prevent him from these actions. And he, Mr. EMMOTT, pick up not only the war scenario, but also maritime blockade scenario, which is really impressing me a lot. I totally agree with Mr. EMMOTT on this point. Second quotation I want to have is his last point, three-way of deterrence. First, he said deterrence against a Chinese invasion or blockade. Second, he picked up deterrence of any move towards independence by Taiwan. But thirdly, and most interestingly, he states deterrence of any move in American politics. This is a very important point for all of us here today. Yes, we have a lot of concerns about China, without any question. Second, we have some concerns on Taiwan presidential election, including the recent comment by a presidential candidate, Lai Ching-te, about his intention to enter White House if he is elected. But we usually, as academia or policy planners, discuss these two aspects, and we call them as dual deterrence. But Mr. EMMOTT adds third point, deterrence of any moves in American politics. This is very important, and we have to realize, now United States is not always status quo power. In the past, we have many, Taiwan crises in the past. But in the past, United States always tried to behave as status quo seeker. But recently, the US politics has its own inclination to change the policy in Taiwan Strait. Of course, we have to admit, like as a recent study from Brookings Institution by Ryan Haas, Bonnie Glaser, and Richard Bush shows United States has some sensible attitude to Taiwanese politics and also Chinese politics. These people know very well and keep institutional memory from the past. But we also have to realize in the United States, some political movements, especially in the Capitol Hill, lead to more provocation or change of American policy toward Taiwan Straits. So I again agree with Mr. EMMOTT about the United States could use its power or its politics to change the situation. And that is what we have to pay our attention. Okay, secondly, we want to ask from where we can go. I mean, from this dangerous situation, where we can go. How should we use our imagination to combine diplomacy and deterrence, as shown in the title of today's event, to avoid crisis? Before asking question to Mr. EMMOTT, just let me share my own thoughts just a little bit. First of all, the current situation in the Taiwan Strait compared to past three famous Taiwan Strait crises in 1950s and 1990s should be viewed as a continuation of undermining of stability. Yes, we are already in crisis, and this crisis could take longer than we expected. We expect to settle down. In the past, why were past crises avoided? In the past, in 1950s and in the 1990s, top leaders in Taiwan and China and the United States had the intention to avoid crisis and to put an end to crisis. And even sometimes they didn't have good communication channel, but they tried to pave the way to transmit their intention to the other side. And also, in the past, political events sometimes ended, like in 1996, and it means the end of crisis. In the 1955, back to 70 years ago, the Banton Conference was another very key event, and China suddenly started to calm down its reaction to Taiwan Strait. But we have to admit, today we don't have these elements. First, top leaders in 3 capitals don't share their intention, true intention. They may want to avoid war, but the communication channel are so weak, especially between US and China. Also, as I say, this is continuation of undermining of stability. And we cannot imagine some events may put an end to this continuing crisis along the strait. Second comment I have is, the United States and China is now in a very difficult confrontation or competition. And they start to mix up everything. In the past, for American leaders and for Chinese leaders, the management of Taiwan issue has its own context. And they try to keep stability, even though they have many political arguments besides Taiwan. My point is now, because the confrontation between 2 superpowers, everything are mixed up. So they start to forget the sensible idea that Taiwan Strait issue should have its own context and should keep its stability. That is my big concerns. And third, I want to mention about role of Japan. It goes without saying that Japan is likely to become a war theater in the event of Taiwan contingency. In this context, Japan should, on the one hand, take every possible deterrent measures, such as prepare the ability to let the other party know without misunderstanding that probability of success of such attempt is very low. Japan's basic policy is also to defend its own territory, protect its own people, and provide logistical support for US forces in the time of contingency. Japan may also need to work on building a system to prepare for eventuality that Japan actually becomes a battleground, including legal issue. I mean, Japan has to think more about the worst case scenario and how could we work together with the United States and other forces in the region within the limitation of our constitution. But on the other side, on the other hand, it is also very important for Japan to help the United States, China, Taiwan accurately understand each other's intentions and encourage stability-oriented diplomacy. In terms of diplomacy, Japan should also take a stance of demanding not only China, but also United States take steps to prevent the Taiwan issue from spiraling out of control. We, Japan, or Japanese government, may understand the true intention of American government, but as he and I argue, in the American politics, we have many hawkish boys. Japan needs to convey the message even to the Washington and American government. We are okay to strengthen the deterrence, but we also have to wear highly politicized action might not help us, might not help the peaceful situation in the region. Also, we have to be very clear to China that its military posture only reinforces our perception that China is changing the status quo. And we want to see the assurance from China's side. Chinese military exercise, for example, last August one, very close to our southwestern islands, never helpful to Chinese interests and the regional peace. So we shouldn't forget about being critical to either party along the Taiwan Strait. Why? Because we have to preserve our peace. And that is everybody's interest in the region. Okay, let me ask questions to Mr. EMMOTT. First, these questions, only 4 questions, very easy question. So I think it is very easy for him. So I really want to encourage all participants to make more harder questions to him. But let me ask just a few questions. Not only is there mutual distrust between the United States and China, but the current lack of respect in the United States and in China appears to be exacerbating the Taiwan problem. So, can the United States and China really have a dialogue that can produce results or outcomes in the first place? It is hard to imagine, at least for me, the current dialogue between the United States and China will be the start of it. Is there really any chance that United States and China can reach some kind of meaningful agreement to avoid a crisis? Even if they are serious about dialogue, this is the second part of the question, what kind of mechanism could we envision? It would be assumed there would be some atmosphere of detente, such as disarmament treaty, like in the Cold War, and that could create a meaningful mechanism for the United States and China. But that might require US and China would experience crisis first, like Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And also, if that mechanism they start to discuss, would it also be something that would satisfy the actors involved, such as Taiwan and Japan? If US and China, these two only, make some rapprochement, make some detente process, and make some mechanism to stabilize the issue, Taiwan, Japan, and other players might be left out. And they may oppose to that idea. They may oppose to that mechanism. So how could we envision the launch of the new mechanism, even if the United States and China start to make a meaningful dialogue? Third question is, are the leaders rational? Yes, we want to believe our political leaders have rationality. But sometimes, like Putin last year, their calculation might be misguided by their own inclination to the past or their own prejudice, their own experience in the past. So my third question is very simple. Are leaders rational now and in the future? We know Xi Jinping, but how about the next US president? How about Taiwan next president? We want to discuss about the year 2024, but every 4 years we have election in Taiwan and then in United States, this order. Somehow, every 4 years overlapped Olympic Games, right? Summer Olympic Games. But Summer Olympic Games year will be the years we have to be terrified by their impact, by the impacts of two countries' election. This is my third question. The fourth question is actually a question, but also my personal comments and question. This is, in what discourse space should be Taiwan contingency be discussed? After the war in Ukraine, there has been more discussion about taking side of justice in Japan and in the world. In this context, discussion of deterrence, military response, always gain momentum and popularity. I personally acknowledge the need to discuss military affairs, but how should the space of discussing diplomacy necessary to avoid war? And how should we keep freedom of speech in Japan and in the world? As I said, in the past, we could speak more freely about Taiwan contingency, China, or like Russia, but now, everybody expect which side you are, right? Which side of justice you are. So how should the tension that should exist between order and justice be discussed when war is likely or in the midst of war? If US-China confrontation, Chinese expansionism, and further worsening of the crisis along the Taiwan Strait keep occurring in the future, this issue of freedom of speech will become even more important. And I want to know how you think about this. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for listening to my comments.
Okay, now we'd like to move to the discussion part of today's lecture. Since Professor Sahashi just asked 4 questions to Mr. EMMOTT, we can start from there. Yes?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Sahashi-sensei, for your very excellent commentary, which I learned a lot from, and I very much appreciate your careful attention to the issue and to my lecture. You, of course, very misleadingly described your questions as easy questions, and I think they're not so easy questions. But let me try to answer them. Your first question was, can the US and China really improve relations through dialogue? Is there a chance of reaching a meaningful agreement? And your kind of part B to that question was, what kind of mechanism? I think my answer to that question is that dialogue alone is not really likely to be enough. In other words, which I think is your thinking as well, that just while it's necessary for the US and China to have dialogue, there's an interesting debate going on in the United States about whether or not looking for dialogue is itself a sign of weakness or whether it's a sign of strength. And the fact that there is that debate leads one to be pessimistic about the chances of it leading to a success, because if simply the idea of communication is considered to be either a sign of weakness or strength, itself a bargaining tool, and that there's a perception on the American side that the Chinese side grant communication as a kind of tool, then that starts the process off in a very difficult place. So I cannot have any view other than the idea that having dialogue must be better than not having dialogue, but nevertheless, I don't think we should expect it to lead to meaningful agreement without a mechanism, as you rightly say. So what kind of mechanism could lead to a meaningful agreement? I think probably, well, I'm not very optimistic about that either, but perhaps in theoretical terms, I suspect a mechanism that, first of all, definitely in some way included Taiwan itself would probably be necessary. A mechanism that took an input or appreciated that the view of the Taiwanese people, but also of the Taiwanese leadership, had a role to play, would be the sort of mechanism that would have a chance to be sustainable. But whether the Chinese side would agree to that mechanism, I think, must be a matter for doubt. And then I think the sort of mechanism that would have a chance to succeed would be then a mechanism that included a wider range of other countries as well. It's not clear to me that a bilateral solution is really possible, at least as a meaningful solution. A bilateral effort to try to de-escalate and to like find a pause in this crisis, rather as happened in 1996 or in 1955, is, I suppose, possible, and we should accept that just a pause is a good thing, and that could be bilateral. But I suspect that something really meaningful would need to involve other, particularly Taiwan itself, but also other parties. However, the complexity that would contend with is that a fundamental difference between the two sides is that from a Chinese perspective, their agreement on Taiwan with the United States in the 1970s and beyond, and with the various other communiques since, has from their point of view included the notion that there is a Taiwanese path to unification, and that therefore movement along that path is to be expected, and that an absence of movement is itself a grievance, whereas the American understanding is different. It is rather that they take no position about the future status of Taiwan as such, and that I think the one China policy is a very strange policy, but it's a reality. But it's hard to understand it from a kind of detailed textual point of view. And as a sidebar, it seems to me that historians of this, hopefully not historians who are trying to analyze the causes of World War III, but rather historians who are trying to look at it in the future, will, in my view, need to debate why America did not recognize the People's Republic of China in 1949 or 1950, at the time when some other countries did, including the United Kingdom, and what difference that might have made. Possibly it would have made no difference, but it would seem to me it will be an interesting, an important counterfactual for historians to think about. So, are leaders rational? The third question. I think the lesson with Vladimir Putin is that they are rational, but the problem is understanding their form of rationality in terms of what interests are they serving, and what kind of calculations are they serving. And the natural mistake we always make is of thinking in terms of a rational calculation of, if you like, a national objective, and on the basis of the information we have, whereas Putin may have made a rational calculation on the basis of a personal objective and on the basis of his particular type of information. So I suppose in the end then the concept of rationality may not be a useful one in determining whether or not conflict gets described. But I think the point that you make that especially the electoral cycles mean that we cannot easily depend upon a stable long-term policy in Taiwan or the United States towards this issue, and we're constantly managing that policy. Clearly, China is also has a policy with some volatility, but not as regular a volatility as there and as here. And maybe I should add that on this question of extremism about Taiwan within the American debate, I think that it is, I should emphasize that it is not mainstream at all, but the fact that it is held by some quite significant sort of advisors and quite some, and by some candidates who then might surprise us by emerging, means that we have to take it seriously, even if it's not mainstream. We can hope that careful analysis would come in to calm down someone who took that view, but nevertheless, I think that American policy is not easily bound anymore. So the final question, the most difficult one, in what discourse space should Taiwan be discussed? I mean, I think the first place it should definitely be discussed is in Taiwan itself, and we have a tendency as outsiders, whether Japanese or American or British, to talk about the issue as if the Taiwanese people have no say over the matter, and I think that the debate and the view of Taiwan itself is the most important discourse space. But then I think it is not clearly a black and white issue. And therefore, I think what is important, what you're implying, is that we should not treat it as a simple issue of one thing like justice or democracy or even self-determination, although maybe self-determination is a more fundamental principle, but that we should accept that there are a number of different principles that can apply, and therefore we should have a debate about what those principles are and what the facts that lie behind them are there. So I suppose that's my general answer. It is hard to come to the question without your own strong kind of bias in discourse, or at least your own principles that you're applying. But the fundamental issue is that we don't have a shared set of principles between not just the US and China or the West and China, but also involving a lot of other countries. And I think if a mechanism is to be found, if there is to be any sort of international pressure, then involving other countries in this debate, other countries like India, other countries like Indonesia, other countries like Singapore, other countries within the Indo-Pacific especially, in the issue will be important, rather than treating it as a binary question. So it wasn't a very easy question that you asked. But I'd like to very much follow Professor Sahashi's lead in encouraging contributions and questions from the room, because I think I will learn most from your questions.
Excuse me. Please set interpretation receiver channel 1. Okay.
Testing, testing. This is the interpreter speaking into the English channel. This coming through? Very good. Mr. EMMOTT, thank you very much for a very valuable lecture. I would like to express my appreciation to you. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to ask you about the United Nations. The functions of the UN so far has been hollowed out. The Security Council is not functioning now. And this is very important in terms of being able to deter international conflicts. This is a major negative, that the Security Council is not functioning. Is it possible to evolve and reform the UN Security Council? Is that possible? If not, the possibility of the Third World War could be very high. We had the First World War, and after that, there was the League of Nations, and after Second World War, we have the United Nations. If we go into Third World War, I don't know, but if there should be such a war erupting, and is there going to be a new League of Nations? I don't know. Or is the current United Nations, by reforming the current UN, are we going to be able to stop international conflicts? I'd like to ask you this question, Mr. Emmett.
Thank you for oh yes, yes, right. You're speaking to this. Thank you for an excellent question about whether the United Nations could be reformed to make it a useful conflict resolution body. I think that, I mean, the answer is that, of course, the United Nations is a potential mechanism for the kind of thing that Professor Sahashi asked, but it's only such a mechanism if the US and China agree that it should be one. The United Nations was set up in order to try to reinstitute, to reestablish the compulsion of debate, of discussion between the great powers after the Second World War. And during the Cold War, it was hollowed out because the USSR and the West really could not agree on any substantial use of the United Nations. And then it achieved more influence after the fall of the Cold War. And now that there is great power rivalry again, that is why it's hollowed out. So my answer is that the United Nations could be reestablished, but only as a tool for the great powers, for the United States and China, hopefully with others from Europe and Japan and others encouraging, to provide like an acceptable non-bilateral mechanism. But the precondition is that the US and China would have to agree to that. So I think the answer is that it's not very likely that it could, the UN cannot be reformed except by the agreement of the US, China, and Russia, and currently that is not going to happen. So it's a chicken and egg problem, that which comes first. You have to have an agreement between the great powers to then restore this mechanism to make that agreement more stable and sustainable for the future. But until you have the agreement between the great powers, it's useless.
Yes, yes, yes. ついでに
Can you please allow other persons to ask the question?
よろしいでしょう
Thank you very
か
much.
じゃあそこの
Yes, please. Yes.
ありがとう。
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question, but I have a child, too little. Apologies beforehand, because with my lack of understanding, I might ask something off the point about the United Nations function and the reform. Thank you for your response. But there was the First and the Second World War, and again now. Hegemony, hegemonic rivalry is the cause of the war. So is that because of the existing power and the rising next potential hegemonic country? Those presence need to cause the war. So war occurs because of two-country rivalry. And you talk about the agreement of the superpowers, the United Nations reform or the function, or to maintain global peace. There must be an agreement between the superpowers. And if the agreement between the superpowers is not possible, I listened to you and I thought after it is not possible to have a peace mechanism or a functioning United Nations anyway.
Well, that's why I think it's a very good observation. That's why I said, and I think Professor Sahashi agreed, that we're in a very difficult period of transition, because we're in a time when the superpowers are in intense rivalry with one another, lacking a clear incentive for either cooperation or broad consultation, because of the lack of trust between them, and because of rivalry, including territorial rivalry. So we have to find a way to get us past this transition to a time when, thanks to a broad balance of power in the world in which these two powers are not, in which perhaps neither of them has the chance for hegemony, because other powers are strong enough to prevent any power having a potential ambition for hegemony, either regional hegemony or global hegemony, then in that world, a body like the United Nations might have a greater chance of being operational or working. But so we have a dangerous period in which the possible achievement of hegemony is there, and therefore is a potential incentive for conflict. The world would be much better without hegemony. A dispersion of power. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Okay, so maybe we can take one more questions over there.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about energy situation. There was an energy crisis when Russia invaded Ukraine in terms of gas supply to Europe. When it comes to Asian countries, we import large amount of oil and gas from Middle East using waters closer to Taiwan areas as an access route. What Japan and other Asian countries should do to prevent such crisis that happened in European countries?
Well, I think the answer is to ensure you have a diversified source of energy supplies. And secondly, to have a system, energy system, both of importing and of producing energy that is adaptable, that is capable of reacting quickly to new price mechanisms and also new political mechanisms. I think the lesson of Europe's energy crisis is that countries were not sufficiently diversified, but they have proved very adaptable. So perhaps a surprise about the energy crisis is how quickly actually the energy crisis declined. Now this is partly thanks to globalization. So it meant that you could change supplier from Russia to Algeria or to liquefied natural gas from the United States. So it's globalization, number one. But number two, it was technological change and the ability to accelerate the adoption of some renewable energy and other kind of technological solutions, because systems were not excessively rigid. So and of course the irony for Japan in its energy policy is that a major reason for the Sakhalin liquefied natural gas investments in Russia were an effort to diversify your supply of energy resources to avoid excessive reliance on the Middle East, but also in some of the balance of the way in which nuclear power was going to decline and so forth. So I think the right answer for a country is to diversify sources of supply as much as possible, but secondly, to ensure that the energy system is capable of adaptation. The electricity grid is capable of receiving energy in new ways, of that planning legislation and other legislation concerning the use of renewable energy, wind or solar or hydro or other sources, is also capable of exploiting new technologies and responding to market mechanisms. And I think in we're still only less than 1.5 years after the invasion of Ukraine. I think it's quite remarkable that actually the energy crisis declined so quickly. The food crisis has been more difficult because of the Russian and the Ukrainian exports of wheat, but the energy crisis has been a remarkable success for globalization in many ways and technological change. And so the final recommendation is to avoid attacking globalization, avoid excessive moves away from globalization through protectionism and through so-called decoupling, because that could interrupt or prevent the ability to have a flexible response to a crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Sahashi, anything to add?
Just one thing is to our second questions from student. Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, but we have to admit, everything start to be, according to my friend, everything start to be binary, right? 0 or 1. I mean, Nishinho. So, it's like a United States side or China side, or justice side or injustice side. This is a way of thinking we start to see in recent years. But, this is very dangerous sometimes, or risky, in terms of intellectual activities, right? Because to talk about Taiwan contingency, we shouldn't forget about the interests or dreams of Taiwan people, or the people residing in the neighboring area, including our southwestern islands, right? But the top leaders in both capitals tend to think, oh, this is a war we have to manage. This is a war we have to start, right? But the thing we really have to think as a student is, how can we put more stakeholders' perspective to the discussion, right? So we shouldn't see or do nothing against the kind of dominance of discourse by the two governments, right? So I think your question was super excellent, because that is a point we easily forget, right? Oh, this is a hegemonic war. No, we have to think beyond that. Okay, thank you very much.